DBL hat trick. Good morning, B Murph. Good morning, Joe. Just getting things set up here. Good morning, Chen. Let's see. Good morning, Alex. Good morning, Foreign Wanderer. How are you guys doing today? Morning, Formula Q1. What's up? How you doing, Phil? Morning, Jenna. Buenos dias. I'm about to have a lunch hour filled with MATLAB fun. Doesn't that sound like the best lunch hour ever? Doing MATLAB, eating some food. Good morning, Hank. Good morning, Chimney Stacks. It's the best. I love my life. Name that movie. Hank, currently at Palm Springs International Raceway with Tanner Faust driving my car. Who's Tanner Faust? I'm sorry, I feel like I should know. Chin says, for the graduate project, does the topic, does it have to be chosen between the topics showed in the description? No. Those topics that I list are just to get you thinking. There you go, Hank. That's from Nacho Libre. Which is, it's just a really good film. It's just really great. Wait, where's that graduate project? Hey, morning, MJ. Let's see. So for those of you who are graduate students, I did post a description of the graduate project, and this is what Chin was talking about. The first thing you need to do by Friday, October 16th, is give me a topic that you want to do. And I listed a bunch of stuff here, but you don't have to pick one of these. This is just to give you an idea of the type of stuff that's out there that I think is interesting or that people have looked at before. Tanner Faust is a professional race car driver, drives for Rockstar. Up against the ZR1, a 2,000 horsepower Viper. Oh my goodness. Wait, so your car is going against all these supercars? Is that what you're trying to say? Is that what you're telling me? That's pretty cool. Okay, let's find this thing. Alright, okay, I gotta fix this. We're looking at cornering, stiffness, and okay, let's just leave it at there, because that's an important one. Okay. Guys, remember, this Friday, we're not going to be meeting here on Twitch. We are going to meet on Zoom. I posted the link on UB Learns. And We have John Robinson, motorcycle tire design engineer from Sumitomo, which used to be Dunlop tires. And I'm really excited. He's a great guy, super knowledgeable about tires and motorcycle racing in particular. So that'll be cool. We also have a homework due Friday. And I'll have office hours tonight. So definitely come and ask questions, whatever questions you have. About the homework, can we just submit a PDF of the published code? That'd be okay. That'd be okay. Bump the homework to Saturday. Hey, I'm sorry. Friday's the day. You'll be there tonight? Okay, I'll see you there, Phil. There's also office hours on Thursday night, run by our TA, Suvik. So you can also come then. Okay. Ooh, finished. Very nice. Yeah, once you get going, I think this homework it's pretty reasonable. It's a cool result. You get to see how this car performs over the quarter mile. And it's decently close to the real performance of the car. If you look up quarter mile times for a ZR1, it's going to be pretty close to what you get. You have the power. Okay, guys, let's get on with the content for today. So we're talking about lateral tire forces, and I think the image that you want in your mind, go back to some of these videos and notice that depending on the direction that we're cornering, you're going to get tire deformation in the direction that you're cornering. So here we got a view underneath the front right tire, and this car's turning left right now. So the tire is stuck here in the contact patch. I don't know, I'm kind of like drawing what I imagine that contact patch underneath. And the car itself, if I'm turning left, it kind of wants to keep going off to the right. But the contact patch is stuck to the ground. So the car is kind of like pulling this way just because of its inertial force. And that stretches the tire relative to this contact patch. But the tire acts like a spring, and it's trying to pull the car back this way. And that's like the basic intuition about how tire forces are being generated. The tire's stuck to the road, and then it stretches and it pulls the whole car towards the contact patch. And we measure this deformation, this lateral deformation in the tire, using a slip angle, which is this angle in here. It's the angle between the wheel plane of the car, of the tire. So think of this tire plane as, this is where the tire's pointing. But the direction that the tire is actually heading, the velocity vector, there's generally a difference when you're cornering. When you're going straight, the tire plane is lined up with the velocity vector, but most of the time it's interesting in Formula One races or any race when you got crazy corners and whatever, and so there's going to be a difference there. Okay. And so Today we're going to talk about cornering stiffness and the tire friction coefficient, and it's related to this slip angle. So let's get into it. So below, I'm going to show you the results of a tire force. Below are the results of a tire force testing. No, we should just call that a test. Results of a tire force test. And this test determines the amount of lateral force produced by a tire per slip angle. Okay, so let's talk about what's happening here. On the horizontal axis of this graph, we have the slip angle, alpha. And you can see that the slip angle is increasing this way. It's going from 1 degree all the way up to 8 degrees. And so going back to the picture from before, this is showing an increase in angle between the tire plane and the actual velocity vector of the tire. So going back to a picture, this one I like. It's kind of like this, where this angle in here, they're increasing it. And so basically in the tire contact patch, the tire is getting stretched more and more and more. Okay, so that's how you interpret the x-axis. The tire is getting stretched in the contact patch more and more and more, and it's measured with the slip angle. Now, what happens to the lateral force? So we'll refer to lateral force as F sub y. So like longitudinal force, we had F sub x, like in the x direction. This is going to be in the y direction. And notice this is going to be in pounds, pound force here. Notice that these numbers are negative. And that's just sign convention. We'll worry more about that later. But I want to point out there's 3 regions of behavior for lateral force that a tire makes. And the first one is the elastic or linear region. And we call it the linear region because as the slip angle increases, the lateral force increases linearly. So we can get the slope of this. So the slope would be the change in lateral force. And I guess the vertical axis, we're actually plotting negative lateral force. But I'm taking the derivative of that quantity with respect to the slip angle. So that's the slope there. For small slip angles, like you can see this linear region, it persists up to like 2 or 3 degrees. And I think usually when you're driving a passenger car, you're existing in this region, okay? These other regions are in racing, or if you're getting into a pretty sketchy situation out on the road. Okay, so the second region we call the transitional region. And we call this transitional because you see that this linear trend does not continue anymore. The lateral force kind of tapers off. It's not as increasing as quickly. And this is for larger slip angles, like we're getting to 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees. Once we get to, at least for this tire, this is what is this? A Goodyear shaved racing tire. So this is like for NASCAR or Indy or something. It's like a high performance tire. Eventually the force levels off. And so this will be the maximum lateral force. And this happens at some transitional slip angle, so like 6.5 degrees or something. Now, if you go beyond this slip angle, the tire starts to produce less lateral force. And if this graph continued, it kind of goes down and levels out. It doesn't keep going down, it kind of like levels out. And what's happening this way is the tire's starting to slide. But if you're racing and you're trying to get around a corner as fast as possible, you want to be in this region where I'm producing the most lateral force, and that's going to allow you to go faster through a corner. And you're kind of playing this gambling game where you're trying to get the slip angle of the tire to around 6 degrees. It's different for different tires, but if you go beyond that, you're going to start to lose traction. So racing, especially with corners, it's balancing on a knife's edge. When you're drifting, Gary keeps asking about drifting, at least some of your tires are, over here. They're not producing maximum lateral force anymore. They're kind of sliding. So generally, drifting isn't the fastest way around a track because you're not generating the maximum lateral force. I don't know if Gary would argue with me there, but okay. So according to SAE convention, so the Society of Automotive Engineers, a positive slip angle creates negative lateral force. So that's just the convention. So that's why in this graph I have positive slip angles here, negative lateral force. And this will make more sense once we develop the dynamics here. You'll see like which directions things are pointing, like what that means. But for now, just take it that a positive slip angle is going to be negative lateral force. Okay, by the way, lateral force is defined positive to the right hand of the driver. So if you have a positive lateral force, according to SAE convention, that means you're cornering to the right because your tire needs to be producing a force to the right in order to corner to the right. So positive lateral force generally means a right turn, and your tires are going to have a negative slip angle in that case. Okay, from the graph, we notice that lateral force increases linearly when the slip angles are small. What if we meet a sharp corner and have to make the slip angle greater than 8 degrees? Well, hold on to your hat. Put on your seatbelt. Well, what you can do in a sharp corner is slow down as well. And that happens in Formula One. I forget which famous racetrack it is. Monaco or something? I hope I'm not getting that wrong. But there's this famous hairpin turn. It's like super tight. And it's also down this steep grade. It's like you're going down into the turn and then you have to really tight. Yeah, Monaco. Okay. And they slow down to what? 20 or 30 miles per hour going through that turn. Because the faster you go through a turn and the tighter that turn is, the more lateral force your tires have to produce to hold you into that corner. And you notice this when driving around yourself. If you make a turn and you don't have to go very fast through a turn to really feel yourself thrown around. So sometimes the drifting is hard to. No. You don't have to drift. You could slow down. There's nothing wrong with slowing down into a corner. Okay, so lateral force increases linearly when the slip angles are small. So that's the linear region. And this brings us to the definition of tire cornering stiffness. So the tire cornering stiffness is defined as the slope. So before I write the equation, this slope in the linear region, we define this as the tire cornering stiffness. So if your tire has more cornering stiffness, it means you get more lateral force per slip angle. So like we'll talk about Formula 1 tires. They have an absurd cornering stiffness. If you stretch the fiber just the tiniest amount, creating a small slip angle, the cornering force it produces is just like astronomically more than a passenger tire. All right, so cornering stiffness, it's defined as the slope in there. So what was that slope? It's the derivative of the negative of the lateral force with respect to the slip angle. And on top of that, we add this extra detail where we say you should be taking this slope close to where the slip angle is 0. So you should be, where do I like calculate that slope? Well, you should be close to the origin when you get that slope, so to make sure that you're in the linear region. So we could also write this as minus the derivative of the lateral force with respect to the slip angle close to the origin there. So in other words, the cornering stiffness is the negative of the slope if you're plotting lateral force versus slip angle. In the figure above, it was the slope itself because I plotted negative Fy. So don't let that confuse you. We'll do an example in a second that shows this kind of orientation. So we'll get to see both. And when you get the slope, you should be close to the origin. So the units of the cornering stiffness are, so it's lateral force, so it's a force divided by an angle. So we often express cornering stiffness in newtons per radian of slip angle or newtons per degree of slip, or pound force per degree. So you can see cornering stiffness expressed in all these different ways. So you'll just have to be careful with the units here whenever you're doing calculations. So that's cornering stiffness. Let's talk about the friction coefficient of a tire. So let's talk about static friction, because this is what we're hoping for with tires, that the rubber is sticking to the road, and that's like a static friction force. So we often express static friction force like this. So this will be familiar to all of you. You take the static friction coefficient and you multiply it by the normal force. So that's just a common definition of the friction coefficient. And we define the friction coefficient in such a way that we can predict the maximum static friction force before the relative surfaces start to slide, right? Like that's what the static friction coefficient tells you. It's like, how much force can I apply to some static object before it starts to slide? And that boundary is this right here, the friction coefficient times the normal force on that object. So it's the same with tires. This maximum friction coefficient, or this maximum friction force for a tire, coincides with the maximum lateral force a tire produces. Because think about this. If a tire starts to slide relative to the road and it's no longer sticking, well, then the tire isn't really being stressed as much anymore. And the stress on the tire is good because it's like a spring. You want to put a lot of stress on it so that it deforms and then it pulls the car. But if I lose that friction between the road, then the tire just starts to slide. It's not able to pull the car anymore, and you just slide out of the corner. So we use the following relationship to determine the lateral tire friction coefficient. So here we go. What you do is you take the absolute value of the maximum lateral force. So lateral force is Fy. We get the maximum. And, you know, depending on which way you're cornering, this might be negative lateral force or positive. And that's why I take the absolute value. So this is going to be equal to the friction coefficient, whatever it is, times the absolute value of the normal load, which we call Fz. So Fz is the normal load on the tire. So if we want to solve for the friction coefficient, I run a tire test and I want to say, okay, so what's the friction coefficient? I have to, whatever maximum lateral force I got from my tire test, I divide that by the normal load that was on the tire at that time, and that's my friction coefficient. So now we're going to do an example to calculate the friction coefficient for a real tire. And we'll do the cornering stiffness as well. So this will make more sense once we do this example. Okay, so example, how do you calculate the cornering stiffness and friction coefficient for a specific tire at a specific normal load? So, okay. So here, look at this graph. This is data from a sequence of tire tests. And the tire here is a Formula SAE tire. So what you should know about a tire like this, actually I think I have a picture of it because we're going to go to this next set of notes in a second, but it looks like this. So it looks like a Formula tire, but it's smaller. Formula SAE, we used to have a team at UB. We don't anymore. It'd be cool to bring it back. But you ride a little car like this. It's kind of like a little go-kart. And so the wheelbase from like front axle to rear axle, it's like 1.6 meters. So what is that in feet? I don't know. It's a couple feet. It's kind of like a go-kart. So, but you have this like pretty like nice tire on there, but it's small. So just visualize that when we're talking about, oh, it went all the way to the top. But that's the tire that we're testing here. And okay, so let's look at this axis. This is lateral force. All right. This is slip angle. And notice here, this graph is a little different because I have negative slip angles and I also have positive slip angles. And that's why this graph is kind of whatever symmetry that you call this. But when I turn the tire one direction and that creates positive slip angles, well, SAE convention says that a positive slip angle creates a negative lateral force. So you see all of these ones are negative, but when I turn the tire the other way and I have negative slip angles, well, that produces positive lateral force. So this is like, you have this middle line. This should be a, wait, what did I say? Negative lateral force is a right turn? I have to check. All right, let's check this. The cornering stiffness, no, that's not what I want to see. Negative lateral force is defined positive. Oh wait, a positive slip angle creates negative lateral force. If the lateral force is positive, it's to the right-hand side of the driver. So positive lateral force is a right-hand turn. Okay. So when you're looking at this data over here, that's positive lateral force. So this is like turning the tire to the right. And then this is like turning the tire to the left. And then as I turn it more and more, it creates more and more force in that direction. Now, why are there 5 different lines? These are 5 different normal loads on the tire. So look at this. The really dark line is 350 pounds pressed onto the tire. So what I want you to notice is that the more load you put on a tire, the more lateral force it produces, basically, to a point. And I think that makes sense. Like if you imagine really digging a tire into the ground and really making sure the fibers are interlocked with the road surface, then if you deform it relative to the road surface, then it produces even more force. So when we do tire tests, we run through a bunch of different loads on the tire. And it's important to do this because when you race, depending on which way you corner, the weight shifts in the car. It's always shifting to the outside tire. All right. So, okay, this is what we want to do. I want to calculate the cornering stiffness and the friction coefficient when the normal load is minus 150 pounds. All right, so we're looking at this one. So that's the line that's right in the middle. Kind of this. And, okay, so let's do the cornering stiffness first. Remember the definition of the cornering stiffness. You take, okay, so cornering stiffness is the negative of lateral force versus slip angle when you take that slope close to the origin. So what I need to do is get in here close to the origin and I need to basically try to get a line. That looks pretty good. And if I get the slope in here, well, the way that I would get, like I'm just doing this by eye. When we do this, we're going to have homework related to this where you're going to precisely calculate this slope in MATLAB using a linear regression here that minimizes the squared sum of errors. But we're just doing a basic calculation here. You can see that in terms of vertical change here, if I look over at the right, I've changed minus 400 pounds. That's the vertical change over a horizontal distance of, well, like the distance from here to here is 4 degrees, but we'll just say like this is a little bit less, so it's, I went minus 400 pounds over 3 degrees of change in slip angle. So that's the slope. But cornering stiffness is the negative of the slope. And we define it as the negative of the slope so that this becomes a positive number. Because for SAE sign convention, anytime you do a tire test, there's going to be negative slope here. So, okay, so this is like negative 133 pound force per degree. So I'm just dividing that out. So that means that the cornering stiffness is the negative of the slope, so it's positive 133 pound force per degree. And when you ask somebody, okay, what's the cornering stiffness for a tire? That cornering stiffness is specific to a given normal load. Because notice, let's say if I did 350 pounds instead, if I took the slope for that, it's going to be a larger slope. You can see that. I don't know, something like this. So cornering stiffness increases with normal load on a tire. The more load you press on a tire, the more lateral force it generates per slip angle. Maybe I'll just write that right here. Cornering stiffness increases with normal load. That's an important trend. All right, next, let's find the friction coefficient. So I wanted to get the friction coefficient mu for a normal load of minus 150 pounds. So our definition of mu, the friction coefficient, let's write it right here. Mu is the maximum lateral force, or the absolute value of it, divided by the absolute value of the normal load. And if you, often I'll have students forget what goes on top in this fraction. Is it the normal load or the lateral force? I can't remember. Well, if you ever get stuck there, go back to this equation. Like, what's the definition of friction force? The definition of friction force is mu times the normal load. So whenever you're solving for mu, it's the friction force divided by normal load. So normal load is in the denominator. So that's a way I would reason through it myself. Okay, so what we need to do is find the maximum lateral force for 150 pounds. And let's do it first for a left turn. So what I do is I go in and I look at this line and I say, well, it looks like the maximum happens about there. And you know what? I see it's a little bit less than 400 pounds, but let's just say it's 400 pounds force. So for a left turn, mu is the maximum lateral force, the absolute value. So even though it's minus 400, I took the absolute value, so it's 400. And even though the normal load is minus 150, I took the absolute value, so it's 150. And this is a friction coefficient of 2.67. And this isn't unheard of for racing tires. The friction coefficient can be like 2, sometimes 3. I think John, he talked to our class a couple years ago. He threw out some crazy numbers for friction coefficients. I don't want to misquote him, but I thought they could go up to like 3 or 4, maybe even more. I don't know. What about a right turn? So I can also get the maximum lateral force on the right-hand side. And it makes sense that for a right-hand turn, the maximum lateral force is also pretty close to 400. So, right turn, let's say mu is 2.67. Eagle F1 had the highest, not sure if it still holds. Okay, gotcha. Now, why would a tire ever not be symmetrical for slip angle? Well, sometimes, we'll see if we talk about this, but you can camber a tire. What does camber mean? Like, have you ever seen a car, like if you're looking at it from the back or something? So like this is the back of a car, and we got like brake lights and stuff. But sometimes you've seen cars with like their tires kind of like tilted like this, right? Like they're not straight up and down, they're kind of tilted. So that's called camber. And in that case, depending on your slip angle, it's not going to be the same. If I turn this tire right or left, it's going to generate a different amount of frictional force per slip angle. And if I did a tire test with it cambered on one side, it's going to look different than the other. But here, another name for camber, it's related to the inclination angle. I think they're the same thing, but maybe one angle is defined as negative and the other is positive. But anyways, inclination is like camber. So this car has an inclination angle of 0 degrees. So the tire's just straight up and down, and that's why it's symmetrical on either side. Okay, so this is an example of how you get cornering stiffness and a friction coefficient from a set of tire data. Now, I want to move on to another example. It's on a different set of notes, which I posted last night. Sorry, I posted it really late. I didn't even put an announcement up because it was so late. But I want to go through a little example here and talk about some of these trends here. So this is another set of tire data. I think this is from the same tire. I think this is the same set of data. Something different here. I don't know why I keep doing this. I flipped the axes here. So if you remember the shape of the other graph, it went like the other direction. Well, that's all I did here is I flipped this axis up and down. So this axis is minus Fy instead of positive Fy. What I want to do here is point out a couple trends. You can see here I fit these lines with slopes. So the red one is the highest normal load, 350 pounds, and here's my linear fit. So the slope of this is the cornering stiffness for this tire at 350 pounds of normal force, right? What you can see is, like I told you on the other page, cornering stiffness increases with normal load. So this is the highest load that we tested, and it has the steepest slope. If you were to compile the slopes for each of these lines, for each of those loads, that's what this graph is. So cornering stiffness for this tire as a function of normal load. So look at this. The horizontal axis is normal load. My biggest normal load is minus 350 pounds. This axis is cornering stiffness. This one has the highest cornering stiffness. So this is in pound force per degree. So the slope is 240 pound force per degree at a normal load of 350. as the normal load decreases, look, the cornering stiffness is going down, 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 down. And it's kind of like a quadratic function. Like if you wanted to fit this, you can fit this with a line. And this would allow you to predict the cornering stiffness at like a given normal load, you see? So what they do for tires, when you're trying to simulate a car, well, take a step back. When you run a tire test, it's only reasonable to run a certain number of experiments because they're expensive. You got to run all the machinery. So here we have 5 different tests. With 5 tests, I have enough data to like find a trend. And then if I want to find the cornering stiffness for a normal load of 200 pounds, I don't have to run a whole new test. What I could do is say, look, I fit this function. I could come back in here and have a pretty good guess that at 200 pounds, I'm going to get a cornering stiffness of like 160 pounds per degree. Okay, so that's how cornering stiffness changes with normal load. The bigger the normal load, the bigger the cornering stiffness. Now the friction coefficient is different. It's kind of interesting. It's counterintuitive. So remember, the way to calculate the friction coefficient, you find the maximum lateral force and you divide it by the normal load. So if I want the friction coefficient for 350 pounds, look, this is like close to 800 pounds maximum lateral force. I divide that by 350, and that gives me my friction coefficient. So this plot shows you friction coefficient versus normal load. So on this axis is the normal load. On this axis is mu, my friction coefficient. Okay, the axes are a little weird here because here's my biggest normal load on this side. And my normal load is going towards 0 on this side. So look at this. My friction coefficient is like 2.2 for 350 pounds of normal load. And if I decrease the normal load, the friction coefficient actually goes up. So I reduced the normal load by 100 pounds. My friction coefficient went up to like 2.35. If I reduce it by another 100 pounds, my friction coefficient went up to like 2.55. And this relationship is pretty linear. Check this out. Like you can fit this pretty nicely. I don't know, I'm just doing that by eye. But let's take a second to write this. This is important. Friction coefficient increases, or wait, decreases and further it decreases linearly with normal load. That's what this trend is showing here. Now, I told you about Douglas Millikan. He's like a guru in vehicle dynamics, and he came to UB last fall. And all of us in the class were like stumped. We're like, this doesn't make sense. Like, why would the friction coefficient go down the more like load that I put on a tire? Doesn't it make sense that it would like grip better? And so we asked Douglas Millikan about it, and his explanation was, well, tires are made of rubber. And rubber is a complex compound, and it behaves in really strange ways. And that was his answer. This tire flattening God said. Oh, as far as vehicle dynamics goes, if Doug Milliken says it, he's pretty much. This phenomena has, or phenomenon, I'm not sure which. It has a name. We call this tire load sensitivity. So when we say tire load sensitivity, we're referring to this behavior where the friction coefficient for a tire goes down the more load you put on that tire. But don't get confused here, because this is confusing. If you look at this graph, the amount of lateral force you can produce definitely increases with normal load. So I'm not saying that the more load you put on a tire, the less force it produces, because that's not what we see here. 350 pounds on this tire, that's the highest load we tested. That produced the most lateral force at a slip angle of like 6 degrees or something. But by the definition of the friction coefficient, this ratio is going down the more load you put on a tire. It's an interesting thing. Okay, we ran out of time, but I had, maybe we'll get to this beginning of next week or something, but how can you use this tire data? What does it actually enable you to say about a car? You can, so this is the answer, this is the question I wanted to answer. If I take that Formula SAE car and I put those tires that we've analyzed, if I slap 4 of those tires on this car, what's the maximum lateral acceleration I can get in the car? It allows you to answer questions like that. So you can predict, okay, this tire can produce this much force, and what impact does that actually make for me on the track? So that's the kind of question you answer. So we'll get back to this next time. But that's it for today, guys. That's friction coefficient, that's cornering stiffness. We're going to be dealing with these quantities for the rest of the class because they're an integral part of any vehicle model and predicting your performance. And with that, I'm going to take a sip of orange juice. Guys, don't forget, Friday, we won't be meeting here. We're going to be meeting on Zoom. I sent you the link on UB Learns. Be there and think of some questions that you might want to ask. It's okay if you don't have any, but this is a good opportunity to ask somebody in the automotive industry, like, hey, I've always wondered about this or that. Pulp or no pulp? I get the extra pulp. I don't know if you can you can see how thick that is. Look, the pulp is like stuck to the side of the glass. Extra pulp's the way, bro. That's right, Jenna. Okay, Ricardo says, so we do need to increase the load of the car if we are racing around corners so we can increase the cornering stiffness. I would say, okay, it's complicated, right? Oh, like think of a formula car. and this is what gets really interesting, right? Because what did we say maximizes acceleration at the beginning of the class? Well, you want to maximize your tractive force. And similarly, you want to maximize lateral force. So that's a given. I want to be able to maximize my lateral force in a corner. But here's the thing. You also want to decrease the mass of the car. Because the lighter your car is, the less force it takes to accelerate that car. Okay, so that presents a problem, though, because I need load on my tires so that I can produce more lateral force. But I don't want to do that by increasing the weight of the car because... So think of a Formula car. They make those cars 800 kilograms. It's way lighter than a passenger vehicle. It's like half as heavy. And yet it needs way more downforce. So that's why it has all these aerodynamic surfaces. That's why it has all these fins on it. Because that creates downforce to increase the cornering stiffness of a tire in the corner and thus increase lateral force. But it gets tricky. It gets tricky because when you're in a corner, the car rolls to one side or the other, and that unequally weighs the tires when you're cornering. And that's called lateral load transfer. That's going to happen when you corner. Lateral load transfer is not good for cornering because it increases the load on one tire, which is good, right? Because it increases the cornering stiffness of that tire. But it decreases the load on the other side because you have like one tire that's going into the ground and the other tire is kind of starting to lift. Hopefully it doesn't lift off the ground, okay? When you have tires that are unequally weighted, that's not as good for cornering. So, Ricardo, all that to say, you want to increase the load on the tires in a corner, but you want to do it as evenly as possible between the left and right sides of the car. And it's fascinating. MJ, so I have a question for the homework. I don't think I'm going about it the right way. That's all right, yeah. I have to run in like 2 minutes, but you can ask away. Hey, Ricardo, thank you for the great question. Okay, so I linearly interpolated values for engine power. Okay, to get 6,000 values of horsepower. Then I used the same code from the last homework for finding acceleration for each of those horsepowers and engine speeds. Okay. Then using Euler forward method, tried to find the velocities with nested if statements for changing the acceleration portion based on what I found for optimal transition speeds. My issue is when multiplying the acceleration by a time step, I get some funky results for velocity. Okay, can you come to office hours tonight at 4:30? Because this is probably something we can hash out together. Okay, yeah, come. That'll be good. Lewis, quick question. Is TM out for electrical motor kind of friction or just the torque? It's just a torque. Oh, by the way, I updated some of the notes in the electrical powertrain notes. I updated the portion that talks about how you can do the Euler forward method, because I wasn't really happy with what's the difference between motor torque and the torque out. Kind of confused. Okay, Lewis, the motor torque, the torque out is the reactionary torque on the motor shaft. So it's kind of like what we did with the engine, like an internal combustion engine. You have combustion happening in your engine, and that rotates the crankshaft, right? And that's what we call the torque in the engine. But some of that torque goes into actually overcoming the inertia of the engine itself and like spinning up the crank and all of that. And then the actual output at the engine shaft is what's left over after spinning up the inertia of the engine. So it's the same with an electric motor. You have like some initial torque, but that torque goes into accelerating the rotor of the motor. And that steals some of the torque. But it's like the reactionary torque at the end of the shaft. So it's what actually like goes to the rest of the car. It is weird to think about. So torque out is what really activates the car. Yes. Yes, but when we talk about engine performance, we try to calculate that initial torque that starts in the engine before the inertial losses, because you could keep going with this, right? Because when you transmit torque to the transmission, well, the torque is amplified because of the gear ratios, but there's also some inertial losses there. And even through the drive shaft, there's again some inertial losses. And so eventually we care about, okay, like there's a process happening of torque being transmitted through the drivetrain, but ultimately you're interested in what is the tractive force at the ground. So I wouldn't get stuck up on like the torque that's coming out of the engine shaft is really the torque that activates the car, because that's not even really the torque that activates the car. It's, you keep going downstream and you could say the torque at the axle is what really activates the car. You know what I'm saying? So I would think of it all as something that's connected. It starts at the engine, or it starts at a motor, and it ends at the contact patch with the ground. And they all work together. Okay. Guys, I gotta run to a meeting. Jeremy, quick question. All right, if it takes 20 segundos, I'm already 2 minutes late. Can you come to office hours, Jeremy? Okay, see you Friday. Okay, see you, Jenna. Okay, cool. See you in office hours, Jeremy. Guys, always a pleasure. See you Friday on Zoom. It'll be fun. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Blessings on you.